Oops. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, the host of the Cosmos Society online open house series. And we're here today with Gregory Nagy, who needs no introduction, truly, to this crowd. So we're just going to dive right in. Greg, last fall and summer, you were writing a series about Hercules in particular, comparative mythology series of posts. And at one point that switched into a series of posts on Minoan-Mycenaean Scribal practices, the legacy of those practices. How did that switch happen? What was the connection between those trains of thought?
The burning question was what kind of fair copy the scribes of Pylos, whose records, shall we say, are frozen in time around 1200 BCE, what kind of records, both temporary and permanent, did they keep? And the reason for that sudden burst of interest, or rekindling of interest in my case, was that resident fellows at the Center for Hellenic Studies at the time, her name is Rachele Pierini.
And in fact, she was a guest of ours last fall.
And she's a very dynamic communicator, as I'm sure you discovered. Rachele was working on Linear B projects. Linear B, as you all know, is the name that archaeologists give to the script used by the scribes in Bronze Age Pylos. I already gave the date for Pylos around 1200, and then similar dates, comparable dates for other Mycenaean centers of administration. Anyway, Rachele was studying Linear B texts while she was a resident fellow at the center, and she had already contacted a person that I like to describe as the dean of Linear B studies, or if you like, Mycenaean script studies, Thomas Palaima at the University of Texas in Austin. And Rachele, who's a genius of an organizer, managed to get a very much in demand Tom Palaima to visit the center. We had a kind of informal seminar. And at that point, I got more and more inspired to revisit something that I had done already, I think, in 1912 at the Academy in Athens, which was a riff about the dialects of Greek in 1200 BCE or thereabouts, what they were like. And we're not going to get into that, but I'm saying that suddenly so many things came together that I felt I have to rethink almost from scratch a very basic idea that I had articulated many years earlier. And I think one convenient place to see it is the 1912 paper that I gave in Athens. And here's the idea.
Dear Greg, you don't mean 1912, do you?
Oh, no, I guess I mean 2012. Okay. So can we retroactively correct?
I thought I knew you, and I still do. Good.
So yeah, 100 years later, hey, what's the difference?
No wonder you had to rethink a little bit.
Yeah, just a little. Okay. You know what, Keith, you remember what Dracula said to von Helsing, the investigator.
Can you remind me?
And you are very wise. So Dracula was trying to compliment the wisdom of von Helsing, but he was also being very condescending about the young age of von Helsing. And so Bela Lugosi, the actor who delivered this line, who at the time didn't know any English at all, and this is in the 1930s, delivered the following line: "For a man who has not yet lived one life, you are very wise, von Helsing."
That's a great one.
And somehow for a man who has not yet lived one life, I'll take those 100 years. And that means I'm not a vampire. So anyway, going back to Greg's thinking around what 2012 CE and thereabouts. I hope I didn't say CE earlier when I
don't
meant
think so.
um, um, it all comes together with this one formula, and you've already read me, but if you'll forgive me, I'll just circle back to this formula, which is the irony is that when those big fires in the storage places of the administrative center at Pylos, or if you like, the palace at Pylos, when those big fires burned down that center, the records that the scribes were keeping had different fates. According to my theory, the permanent records, which were kept on what we would call perishable material, like parchment, were burned. And the temporary records, which we know from the context of the clay tablets that have come down to us, those temporary records, which were designed to record transactions only within the space of a fiscal year, became ironically permanent. I was visiting the University of Pennsylvania Museum a few months ago and guided through it by this wonderful archaeologist of record for Troy excavations dealing with the Roman period, Brian Rose. And Brian introduced me to a lot of very savvy archaeologists there at the museum. And I think they reinforced for me even better than I could have told you that clay, if it's sun-baked, is perishable eventually, but it's good to write on. But when it's fire-baked, then it's permanent. And so let me repeat, the fires at the administrative center of Pylos in 1200 BCE made the temporary records of the scribes permanent and made the permanent records of the scribes temporary. That said, however, the more I would be hanging out with Linear B experts, which happened last fall at the Center for Hellenic Studies, the more I realize that I have to say and even think before I say a lot more about what exactly do we have as evidence for my saying that the permanent records of the scribes at Pylos, but for that matter also at Mycenae, and if we shoot back just a couple of centuries at Knossos as well in the island of Crete, that to what extent can I get away with saying about these clay tablets that they were only temporary, and that there was the use of parchment. And that meant that I had to rethink whatever references there may be in the existing Linear B tablets to such permanent records. And I had to start learning a lot, or in some cases, relearning a lot about the use, especially of parchment in the second millennium BCE. May I say one other introductory thing, and then I hope we can just open the floor for questions, comments, doubts, certainties, whatever. I find it such a wonder, this is another sense of wonder, that the word grapho in classical Greek, and I mean the language of Plato in the 4th century before our era, the word grapho in that era of the evolution of the Greek language could refer not only to writing with a stylus, which is what you and I automatically think about, but get this, also painting with a paintbrush, and it gets even better, pattern weaving with thread. Wow, I really still have such a hard time thinking of those two alternatives, which is painting with a paintbrush and pattern weaving with a thread. But I can prove to you that there are contexts in 4th century Greek and in some cases 5th century Greek where that's exactly what's happening. Keith,
I think that you,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
no, go ahead. Okay. About the various ways of producing a picture, weaving versus painting. And
Yeah,
this is just pictures, not writing.
yes,
You related the Latin word pictura, as I
yes.
recall. Could you elaborate on that connection? What does pictura mean, so to speak?
Yes, and here you have an Indo-European root, P-E-I-K, would be what linguists call full grade, and P-I-K, what linguists would call zero grade, because the E of P-E-I-K is missing in the zero grade. So P-E-I-K and P-I-K, the root, is the same root that you see in Greek poikilos, which, as it turns out, and I better keep this short, can refer to the result of pattern weaving, where you weave variety into the patterns, and where the root, P-E-I-K, this Indo-European root, can obviously apply, shall we say, to weaving, to pattern weaving in particular, which is a special kind of virtuoso weaving. Now, in Latin, the word, the same root, which we see in P-I-C, pictura, or for that matter, the English borrowing picture, is the same root. And there it definitely has to do with painting with a paintbrush.
And not to do with weaving.
Not to do with weaving.
Right.
I stopped there because I could go in so many directions, and I want to be guided by this wonderful group. And I'm so happy to be either united or reunited with you all.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go to
I'm
questions.
sorry, Greg. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. May I pop in? The pictura, coming from pingo, you can say that it's embroidering with a needle as well, in a way.
Well, you can, and in fact, Virgil does use it that way. So yes.
So in a way, the line is there as well. It's not that
it's there. It's maybe not as in your face as we see it in Greek, but yes, it's there, at least in the poetics.
Yeah, obviously coming from Greek, I think they picked it up. In a way.
Yes. Point very well taken, Georgia.
Greg, this is Jackie. I had a question. What you were just saying about the paintbrush and the weaving, it just struck a chord, because I remember in your class talking that last session, talking about Plato and the word for idea. Idea, is that the correct word?
Yeah, idea.
Idea, sorry.
4th century, or let's pronounce it in modern Greek as well, to please colleagues like Georgia and Maria, and there's so many other Hellenophones. So in ancient Greek, it would be idea. In modern Greek, idea. Big difference.
The idea of the idea is that it was really a visualization. So what you're saying about, is it like a communication by drawing? And is this influencing grapho and stuff, that it really was a written language, but not the way we know? It was a written visualization.
I love it. I love the way you said it. And in some cultures, it's not as obvious as in other cultures. So in those postings that you had a quick look at, or maybe you got really slowed down because they were sort of heavy reading. In those postings, you notice that I fell in love with Egyptian techniques of
Yeah.
painting as well as writing. And I love the way in illustrations of Book of the Dead traditions, which would be written on papyri and then entombed along with the deceased. In those traditions, you have almost a cartoonish way of reinforcing what is being described as going on in a passage to the afterlife. And I love the fact that for the writing of the text of the Book of the Dead, which of course is not one text, but it keeps moving, shall we say, with each new funerary occasion. In those papyri where this kind of writing happens, there's also a cartoonish illustration. And for the cartoonish illustrations of what is happening, it is, I think, a 4-color scheme, whereas for the writing, it's a 2-color scheme, black and red. And that's how we get, by the way, in English, the word rubric. Rubric is when you really highlight something. And I just love the aesthetics of the way this ibis-headed god, Thoth, Thoth, is represented as holding a tablet in his left hand and writing on the surface of the tablet, where I have a hard time pronouncing this word, palette. Is that the where the palette is actually part of the tablet? So you take your brush and you dip into the palette, then you write or draw, or may I say, paint. And in Egyptian culture, the stylus really is like the old kind of fountain pen we use, except it's a split in a reed, not a metallic point, which is also split. But as for the illustrations, can I say it's with a paintbrush.
Yeah, I come from a design background, and it always struck me that, there's that age-old kind of back and forth between an editorial group and a design group, but it works out in the end. But the biggest difference I saw was that design and designers, not 100%, but they have to get the whole idea. It has to be the whole big picture, and then it's distilled down to its core concepts. Whereas when you write, you have a whole idea, but you're building it syllable by syllable by syllable. So it's big to large, whereas visualization is large to little. So for writing, it seems like a natural fit that they thought big visually, and then to, kind of deliver it out to the masses, you got to then start little to big or whatever. But
I think your observation is so important to think with and to learn from. And here's what I'm very eager to say now. In a lot of art history, what we in a lot of the publications on art history, and I'm even thinking of great experts like Weizmann, there's a tendency to assume that or at least to infer that that text comes first and image comes after. That image is based on text. And what you're saying to us, and I totally agree, is that there's a picturing, but I'm using a metaphor here, an idea that is pictured and that is then mediated by way of both visual art and verbal art. And of course, verbal art can also pretend it's visual art and vice versa, right? But anyway, I'm very keen on how you helped us not assume that text and image is a kind of causal relationship where text causes image or allows image. No, they're interacting together. And to me, one of the most beautiful examples, besides Book of the Dead traditions in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, is classical Persian miniature painting and how it interacts with classical Persian scribal activity, resulting in production of books, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, the so-called Mongol period. There's a lovely book about this, edited by Robert Hillenbrand, and I would urge all of you, if you have time, to have a peek at it. It shows that well, can you imagine? Best place to start is in a beautiful garden, and you have scribes and illustrators working together and actually planning together, just the way you use the word design, the design of the book and what part of the content of the text of the writing goes where on a page and what part goes where else on the page. And I shouldn't be prioritizing like that because sometimes the picture is already, shall we say, conceived, and it's the scribe who has to make sure that that the content of what he is writing, shall we say, wraps around the picture. Can I put it that way? So this is so important.
I would say, and I don't mean to hog this up, I would say design is a design, not only just a picture, it's a system. And that's the essence of good design.
Absolutely.
It's a system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Isn't it true that even in today's world, when we're talking about computer science, isn't there something like a distinction that's sometimes made between a designer and a developer? And
usually the one and the same.
Say it again?
Usually the one and the same, because that's what I do for a living.
Oh, I love it. And to me then, my dear, you're an artist. Do you think of yourself as an artist? I hope.
No.
Well,
I'm
all right.
too conscious for that. I mainly work in payroll systems. There's no art to it.
Well, I don't know. I work with Zoe Lafis, who is has the exalted title of Executive Director of the Center for Hellenic Studies. I'm simply the faculty director, and I always like to say to the people I work with, faculty directors come and go, but Zoe stays. And Zoe happens to be not only somebody who does great work on line items, she makes it an art because she's also an artist. And she thinks that the two are the same. And I bet you really do.
At one time in my life, they were, but not anymore. And I became too long. But anyway, with handwriting.
Yes.
Writing. The image is of the image that you write is of the spoken word.
Yes.
And I've always told my children, my two daughters, that handwriting is your opportunity to do a work of art. Therefore, you should always have neat handwriting. So,
yes.
To me, when they were storing on the permanent and temporary records, would there be a difference in the quality of the symbols?
Oh yes. And can we go to Linear B? If you look at pictures of Linear B, if you've ever seen how it looks, it's got so many curly features in the strokes. And I know I'm exaggerating, but when you just look at it from a distance, it's okay, not all curls, but half curls. And that kind of writing is not very suitable for taking a sharp point and then scratching onto a sun-baked clay tablet. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's just not, and to even to draw a curve is shall we say messy, whereas you can so easily see it with a paintbrush. I once had the experience of auditing a class in classical Persian, taught by a friend who had audited my course in first year Greek. I think it was like 30 years earlier. And so now it was my turn to say, Wheeler, may I audit your course? He said, yes, but you got to do all the work. And it turned out that one of the exercises that this man who was a sadist as a teacher, but still a friend, is he would make us go in each class, make us go to a whiteboard, and with a writing instrument, you know, whiteboards have those wonderful writing instruments. I'm sorry about that, that landline, I never answer it, where the point is really an edge. So depending on how you make your curve, you can make beautiful calligraphic differences in width and non-width as you're doing the writing. And he would actually check on our calligraphy and says, look what you've done. Look what you've done there on the whiteboard. But it really sort of brought home to me how, and here I was a professor being degraded as a very, very lowly doofus student. But it was such an aesthetic experience to learn the strokes. And by the way, in Latin, that's called the ductus, coming from the verb duco, which is a wonderful way of talking about directionality and how, of course, you don't just zig and zag in angles, you also curve, etc. So going back to curves, I'm saying that Linear B was designed for painting. It's so obvious, not for scratching on a clay tablet, which whatever we think about permanent records, the clay tablets were definitely temporary records. There's just no doubt about it. There's no doubt that after every fiscal year, they'd be lumped and you'd start from scratch. Oops, did I say scratch?
Yep.
There's another part of this argument that I'd like to make sure we get to. We've been talking about the mechanism of the writing or the application.
Yes.
But what about the writing surface? How do we know that it's papyrus or parchment and not, say, papyrus, which is in use in the Egyptian examples that you draw on?
Yes, and by the way, I hope we have a reunion of this club here because it turns out that ancient Egypt too, has a whole culture of writing on parchment, which I haven't got to yet. But let's go to Asia Minor, if you don't mind. And by Asia Minor, I mean pretty much the equivalent of the territory occupied by the modern state of Turkey, minus the big outlying islands. But to me, that's also Asia Minor as far as the second and first millennia BCE are concerned. When you look at the premier civilization of Asia Minor in both the second and first millennia BCE, it's well, late second and first millennia BCE, it's really the Greek civilization, and in particular, it's the Ionians who tended to dominate culturally and even politically the Aeolians to the north and the Dorians to the south. And in Ionian Greek, and this is something that I really made a very big deal of, didn't I, in the post that Keith and I shared with you. In Ionian Greek, the word diphthera, which we can translate as parchment, that word was clearly used to refer not only to parchment, but also papyrus. And to me, it's very similar to the way you and I, even if we read the New York Times online, we will still refer to the reading of the paper when it's no longer the paper that we're reading. And I find that just a marvel that diphthera is the prestige word for surface of writing. Even when the surface that you're really using is papyrus. And if we had time to do economic history, there were fluctuations in the Aegean world about when it was more expensive or less expensive to write on one or the other surface. But I just want to insist that that Ionians did use diphthera with reference to papyrus, and Herodotus, the so-called father. Another thing about this, diphthera comes from a verb, big difference, sacrificial animal, I, tan, hide. And going back to 2012, my point there was that the verb depso is, shall we say, lower class Greek as far as the palace administration of places like Pylos was concerned back when, 1,000 years earlier. But in the first millennium BCE, vepso just means, hello, I tan hide. And that's not a very exalted activity. And it's messy and dirty and stinky. And that's why we now have evidence from the Pylos tablets that when parchment was imported into the palace, it had to be imported from faraway places where the stench of the tanner's work would not be evident. So anyway, vepso is just lower class Greek, and it's a dialect that from the point of view of people who were speaking Greek in the second millennium was lower class. For those elites of the second millennium BCE, and this was my big linguistic point, the vowel e, which would be epsilon as we spell it in modern Greek, or the letter e as we would transliterate it in anglicized transliterations of the original Greek. This vowel e would be raised, that's the linguistics expression, to e, which would be spelled iota in Greek, and the letter I in, again, English transliterations of the ancient Greek. So this raising of e to e was a linguistic innovation, but it was a linguistic innovation that is characteristic of the elites who ran the administrations of the power centers in the Mycenaean Empire. And that suggests to me, and that's what I argued, and I have been arguing for a long time, that the word that we translate as parchment in Ionian Greek, diphthera, is a heritage of the Mycenaean era of elite bureaucratic administrations of power centers. And that was because it's a prestige word. And would you like to hear another prestige word that survives from the elites of the second millennium into the lower class? That's what the Mycenaeans would have said, Greek that everybody is speaking in the first millennium. I love this. It's the word that we translate as horse, hippos, which should be hepos, but the Mycenaean heritage has prevailed in this case. And so in the first millennium BCE, everybody is still pronouncing that word in the elite Mycenaean way, even though the Mycenaeans have become extinct as a ruling class. How do you like that?
Any questions at this point?
That was pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah. Astrid, go ahead. I saw you had one earlier as well.
Yeah, I saw Astrid too. Yes.
Professor, coming back to this idea of weaving as a graphos, would you say that that was the written language of women in ancient Greece?
Yes, metaphorically.
Metaphorically, yeah, of course.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a very interesting article which I can dig up for all of you, and through the kindness of Keith, we can share it, by somebody called Tuck, who's a professor somewhere, I forget which college or university in Massachusetts. And he's not a Hellenist, he's an anthropologist, but he worked with an Iranian group of somewhere in the countryside, and I'm sorry, I don't think he could remember where it was, where the women of that society, when they were weaving, would be weaving to the accompaniment of somebody singing songs, which were measured in numbers of syllables. And then the lozenge formed shapes that the women were weaving collectively while one of their colleagues was singing the song, corresponded in number, these lozenges, these weaving units, to the number of syllables sung in the song. So that's just one example of situations where the morphology of song and the morphology of weaving actually interact.
Greg, I was just thinking about the story of Philomena and Procne,
yes.
where she weaves her story because she has no voice, she has no tongue.
Because of the sadist man who cuts out her tongue, and then the way she can reveal her secret to her loving sister is to weave her story of pain. Yeah.
And I saw that you had a question earlier. Is it still relevant?
I think so. I was interested in what you were saying about early writing and remembering, I don't know a lot about early writing, but hieroglyphs and Chinese writing actually are pictures or were pictures.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But my question really, interestingly, just looking at my screen here, there's the word participants with two little silhouettes. I just wonder if modern people are going back to this idea of having emoticons and pictures. But my real question was, how do you think that affects the conceptualization of what we think of as separate activities, writing and painting, or writing and weaving? If in ancient times people saw them as very similar,
yes.
How does that affect our ideas about what we do with them and
what
we can express in them?
But you know, dear Anne, this is our dilemma, that we're prisoners of our own language. And my favorite example, and this is something that Milton, of course, understood perfectly because he transcended the English language, but he had such a hard time reconciling the distinction that spoken English makes between a poem and a song, because for Milton, they're the same. And yet we have this compartmentalization, don't we, in English language, that if it's a poem, you can't assume it's a song or vice versa, and that just doesn't work in most societies that have verbal arts. Well, every society has verbal arts, but you see where I'm going.
Yeah, Jim Morrison, I thought of.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Yes, yes. Oh my.
Yes, very close connections between poetry and song. Yeah.
Very.
But it is, I think, hard to visualize or to conceptualize what the thinking was when you saw it as all of a piece.
Yes, yes. So that's why if I can go back to how we started with this Greek word grapho, which even in our borrowings suggests scratching, doesn't it? Like graph or whatever. Well, actually, wait. A graph can be colored. It can even be a cartoonish, whatever. So, but anyway, the Greek word grapho, um, um, we tend to think of in a special way, because for us, the English word write is that.
Mm.
But in Greek, as I was making the point, it can be not just I write, but I paint, or even hello, I pattern weave. Now here's something. When we say in English, and we do it all the time, and I get so queasy about it, since I was a student of Albert Lord way back when people say Mozart wrote the Magic Flute. How accurate is that? How accurate is that when you think of what it takes to compose the amazing music of the Magic Flute? But we say right, and I don't want to swoop down on people I talk to when they use the word right in that way, because that's just the way it is in English. Right is privileged as a word that means not only I scritcha, but I do a hell of a lot of other things creatively.
I think that the language restricts our creativity to some extent there.
Yes, very much so, very much so. And so that's why it's good that we have the Miltons of the world.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was a lovely set of thoughts that you introduced for us.
I will comment on the Magic Flute. The Magic Flute is more of an opera than just a composition.
Oh yes, absolutely.
One of my favorites, and the Magic Flute has always been one of those sit down and listen to it from beginning to end.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh my God, yes. And that's a point very well taken. It's so much more than song or music or any of those words. I just wish that Mozart had a better librettist.
As do we all.
And you know, can I tell you something that I've actually put down in writing? And I can't say put down on paper. I put it down in writing in one of the blogs, where I say that I find it so interesting that when Ingmar Bergman, or let's try to say his name in more Swedish way, Bergman, when Ingmar Bergman or Bergman directed his movie version, his film version of Mozart's Magic Flute. And I love to introduce the factor of film, which gives us yet another dimension of how the Magic Flute is mediated. It was sung in Swedish, and first I thought, oh, you're making it extra hard, but it turns out that the Swedish translation of the original German is much better poetry than the original German by Schikaneder. And in fact, it's sublime. That also has its own problems. There was one point where I was dying to show people in a meeting like this the moment where Zarathustra utters a prayer for Isis, or excuse me, utters a prayer to Isis and Osiris. And I kept looking for it, because the Magic Flute film version is available on YouTube. And I kept looking for that one moment, because it has English subtitles for the original Swedish poetry here. And I couldn't find it. And the reason I couldn't find it, I finally figured out, is that the Swedish poet made one mistake. He elided the names of Isis and Osiris, which kind of ruined the Freemason imagery, and it also ruined ancient Greek, Egyptian civilization lovers. It just says, "Oh gods," instead of "Oh Isis and Osiris." That's why I couldn't ever find it in the subtitles.
Eleni P, I saw that you wanted to ask a question. Is it the same one that I saw in the chat? Yeah, is it about texo, Greg, and
Oh my
texture?
love that.
Back in the conversation about pingo and
Oh
pictura,
God,
Yes.
fit
I
in the
love it.
semantic field,
Thank you for that question.
semantic range.
Texo, I love the word texo, which
Okay.
which means in attest in if you look at all its attestations in Latin, texo can mean not only I weave, it can also mean I build the ship as a master woodworker. Or I build any kind of piece of furniture or a chariot wheel or whatever as a woodworker. You like that? And it gets better. Texo has a cognate. You know, in Indo-European linguistics, we talk about cousins in the grand Indo-European language family. And so Latin texo is cognate with a Greek noun, not a verb, but a noun. And guess what? It's techne, T-E-K-H-N-E, which gives us technique, etc., which is basically art. If I can go back to balancing budgets, which can also be an art, whatever, it's an art, all right? Now, if now I'm going to play this the other way, what's the Latin word that I just translated as art? It's ars artis, feminine, right? And that noun does not have a verb in Latin, and so you have to look for cognates, and the cognate you find is in Greek, and it's ararisko, and ararisko, or it means hello, I am woodworking. And there's a noun there, arma or harma, which actually means chariot wheel, because making a chariot wheel was the number one, shall we say, level of virtuosity in woodworking. Not bad, right?
Yes,
so,
and it's the same word we use in woodworking to denote the joints, harmos.
Exactly. And in fact, an older word in English, a word that's older than carpenter, is joiner. A joiner is a carpenter. And it turns out, now I don't want to torture you, but I think I can prove to you that the name Homer, Homeros, means joiner. He's the master carpenter. He's the master carpenter of a chariot wheel. And now if I may go all the way back to something that one of you very wise people, but I can't remember which one of you, it's all getting blurred to me, said about communicating by women with the medium of weaving. Could we go to geometric pottery for just a second? And how many of you have actually been to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens? Excellent. And when you enter that beautiful building and you go to the left, you see one of the greatest masterpieces of pottery from the geometric period, which is from the first third, shall we say, of the first millennium BCE, the first 3 or so centuries. On this vase, you see all sorts of funerary scenes, and you see humanoid figures being represented by the potter, and of course there would be painting on the pot before it's fired. So you can say, all right, it's painting technique, right? But when you look at the actual human figures, what you see for the chest of each human, male or female, is an upside down triangle. And for that matter, the head that sits on top of the chest is also an upside down triangle. And so this, I'm using the word again, lozenge effect, is something that you technically wouldn't have to use, since you're using a brush to paint these patterns on this giant vase. Why are you making everything so angular? And my answer is, and I remember saying this to Kelly, because Kelly, you and I, and Sarah and I, and Janet and I, each saw this this vase at different times. I know I said the same thing, whether we were all there at the same time, I can't remember. But my point was that in the geometric era, it's pretty clear to me that a more prestigious form of physical art was weaving, practiced by women, and something less prestigious was pottery, as practiced by men. And in this case, the weaving techniques for representing the human body supersede the painting techniques that could have been there but aren't there. Just a thought. I saw Maria.
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this very exciting and interesting discussion. I would like to take Elena's comment on diphthera. And since also since we have this common heritage with Georgia and Janet
Yes,
and
yes.
all people, can we say that in a way diphthera, because as far as I understood your argument, is that in a way it replaced like any surface where someone can write upon.
Yes.
So we all know that diphthera still is used in Turkish and in modern Greek as tefteri.
Yes.
Tefteri
yes.
is, a surface, usually a paper,
Yes.
like
Yes.
pieces of papers, foils
Yes.
that
Yes.
are around, and you can write it. So are we allowed in a way to add some episodes in the adventurous life of this very exciting writing surface or
Yes. Yes.
surface of composition that started from the Messenians and then
Yes.
has been borrowed to the Persians, to the Aramaeans, to
Yes.
the and ended
I
up
love it.
like to the Turkish and the Greek language, like a surface where someone can write on or can take
I
some
love it.
notes.
Oh, that is brilliant, Maria. I not only agree, I'm so glad you brought up.
I'm not taking credit for this information. It is written on Elena referred to this, and Georgia also responded, and I, and also Janet.
So, but it's still such a timely comment, and thanks to all of you for bringing that in. That there's this Turkish word, and then a kind of retrofit Greek word, but the Turkish word is also in Persian, et cetera, et cetera. What I love about that is that the voyage of the semantic voyage of diphthera is not through just any kind of Greek dialect. It's Ionic Greek dialect. It's the Greek dialect of Asia Minor, and two of the big outlying islands, Chios and Samos. And it's that subgroup of Greek civilization that give us this wonderful gift. Interestingly, only in the Ionic dialect do we find another Mycenaean prestige word that we don't find elsewhere. In standard Greek of the classical period, the word that we translate as hearth, that is to say, the fireplace of family or king or whatever, the word that we translate as hearth is hestia. But in Ionic, it's histie with an iota, which means it's a Mycenaean heritage that bypassed all the other Greek dialects. It's histie. And how do we know that there's a labial element because you have to have either a P, B, PH, or M, or W, in other words, a labial element before or after to make this change happen? Well, think of the Latin cognate of hestia, which is vesta, So there you still see the, may I say it this way, the W. So isn't it wonderful that Ionic has that? And in general, this is going way beyond, but I would love to sell to you the idea, the idea of reading. This is not directly relevant to what we're working on, but an article that I did called Mages and Ionians, and it's in Classical Inquiries as edited by Keith, so it's very easy to find. And in general, there I take a big tour of how the Ionians, even in the context of the Persian Empire, were intellectual forerunners of all sorts of things that actually bypassed other parts of the Greek-speaking world, even Athenian parts in some cases. And the more I think of Ionians, the more I am heartbroken that in the 490s they were so brutally suppressed when they revolted against the Persian Empire. On the other hand, it's just a fact of life that they were always the most prestigious members of the Persian Empire intellectually, even though, of course, it was at the cost of political freedom, or at least political independence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you who had this very important additional riff about diphthera and the life of the word after the ancient times. Very important.
Georgia, go ahead. Maybe this can be our last question.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's interesting enough that diphtheri, thank you, Maria and Helene, that diphtheri actually initially referred to a document where public authority records, bills, were first documented. So that's a thought. But let's go back, if I may, to the image versus writing idea. And I don't think it's by coincidence that actually the first signs, expressions of human art, of art of humanity, were the cave paintings. Somehow the idea that the text, in a way, is always presupposed is not the case there. And you said very nicely that we are prisoners of our own language, and this is not the case in imagery, where it's a universal expressive medium.
Yes,
and I recall, in Iliad, the famous passage, with the kind of the so-called letter, which was engraved on this piece, and in signs that they were not to be deciphered by Bellerophon because he couldn't read this writing. That was in a way, and but the scribe who was able, being in Argos, was able to write this. In a way, it actually presupposes even the link between the different linguistic cultures, and I find it. We go back then again and return to the legacy bit of because the legacy is ongoing, because there is this interaction which is not to be let's say limited to one.
I love it. And I know that Keith said that this has to be the last exchange, but I can't resist mentioning one other little fact, okay, which is that, as I understand it, Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was illiterate. He couldn't read or write, but he could speak fluent high-style Latin. So he could speak Latin, but he couldn't read it or write it. He didn't have to. I had to say that.
I have to know how to end this session. Greg, these parchment documents, were they rolled up when they were finished, or were they folded?
Okay, it depends. It depends whether something is secret or not. So it all has to do with power. That's why I so enjoyed those anecdotes about unsealing a document. And literally, when you fold either papyrus or parchment. And you notice that in my various screeds, you like that, screeds, I did allow for both scenarios, both rolling up and or I should either rolling up or folding, and either papyrus or parchment. But the thing is, when you do fold it up, then you even have sometimes a string, and then the seal is on top of the string, and then the unsealing, of course, is where the activation of power happens. And sometimes it's petty bureaucratic power. Sometimes it's life and death matters of state.
Well, we're a little more open access than that, so no folding and sealing. We'll just roll this conversation up for now. So,
okay,
thanks, Greg. Thanks, you all.
We don't have to fold it; we just roll it. I hope I get reunited with all of you again. I so enjoyed this. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.